Hey everyone, welcome to part 3, the final part of this series. In this part, we'll complete the animation and dive into some new techniques and tips. If you've watched the previous 2 parts, you're already familiar with my workflow. So in this video, I'll skip over the repetitive steps and focus on explaining the important points and tricks in detail. Make sure to watch the whole video carefully so you can learn some cool tricks and create even better animations. So, let's get started. Alright, before we dive into the tutorial, I just wanted to mention that I've fixed the Create Avatar and Properties text because I noticed a typo after reviewing it. The reason I'm bringing this up is to highlight that, when making an animation, it's important to review your work over and over again, from the start until you're done. This helps you catch mistakes and issues that you might not have noticed earlier. I began by fixing the running animation, adjusting some movements to make it look more natural. Since I created frames alternately, it made fixing and adjusting the running animation much easier. These small adjustments may seem insignificant, but trust me, it's the little details that turn an animation into something special. Up next, I want the stick figure to draw a weapon using a pen and start shooting with it. And for that, I need a reference image, which I've already downloaded. Now I create a starting point and go to frame 0. I'll import the reference image into the software and shrink its size. Then, I create a new layer for drawing the gun. Using the Add Point tool, I start drawing the gun. Since the gun is pretty small, there's no need to add too many details. But if you want, you can certainly add more details. Next, I use the Line Width tool to make some of the lines thinner, so the shape looks better. The gun shape is ready now, and it doesn't need any more adjustments or details. I select the shape layer, set its center, and hide the shape in frame 0. Now I go back to the starting point I created and set up the moment when the stick figure is going to draw and use the gun. Now, I make the shape visible in this frame and use the stroke exposure tool to set the stroke of all parts to 0, just like I did with the stick figure in the first part of this series. A few frames later, I set the stroke of the gun's body to 100. And a few frames after that, I do the same for the gun's trigger. Now, the gun is drawn very quickly. I increase the distance between the frames here to slow down the drawing of the gun a bit. Next, it's time to animate the pen. I go into the pen layer, and exactly when the shape starts being drawn, I place the tip of the pen on the first point I created and animate it frame by frame. Once the pen animation is done, it's time to animate the stick figure. I select the stick figure layer and start animating this part. While animating the stick figure's hand, the rest of the body should move slightly as well, to make the animation feel more natural. Now that the gun shape is finished, I want the character to quickly grab the gun and use it. So I animate this part on both the stick figure and gun layers. I go to the gun layer, and here's a useful tip for you. When you create a frame on the timeline, it shows you which movement it belongs to. For example, this part is related to resizing, and all the frames in this line are created only when I change the size of the layer. To make it clearer, first, I increase the distance between these frames so the gun's rotation and movement are slower. Then, by clicking on this part of the gun layer, I create a frame for resizing, and in the last frame, I reduce the size of the gun. This way, as the gun rotates, its size also gets smaller. Now, I go to the stick figure layer and increase the distance between the frames to add a slight pause before the stick figure starts shooting. Here, I press Ctrl F to create a keyframe for this state of the stick figure. Then, a few frames later, I create the stick figure's shooting pose. Now, I go into the gun layer to continue animating it. Then, I go into the stick figure layer, where I make some adjustments to the stick figure's pose. When shooting, the gun kicks back a little, so I first animate this part for the gun layer and then for the stick figure. Great, this part of the animation is done. Now, it's time to animate the cursor. It's better to animate all the layers together to avoid any issues. So after creating a short animation for the stick figure, I go ahead and animate the other layers. Now I want the cursor to block the bullet from hitting itself when the stick figure starts shooting. So first I create this animation for the cursor, and then I move on to drawing the shape. To draw the shape, I go to frame 0 and create a new layer called block. Here, I check the autofill option to make sure the shape I create has color, and then I draw a rectangular shape. I hide the shape layer at frame 0. Then, right when the cursor starts drawing the shape, I make the shape visible. I shrink the shape to its smallest size, and then I move it to the tip of the cursor. Now, as the cursor moves, I increase the size of the shape. I animate the cursor frame by frame to make sure it stays in the right position. And that's how I create the animation of the rectangle being drawn by the cursor. Then, I move the cursor to this position as if it's holding the rectangle shape in front of it. After that, I animate the rectangle's shape. When the bullet hits the shape, I need to add a slight shake effect to it, so I animate that part too. Now let's move on to the special effects. To create the effect, you either have to draw it frame by frame or use my method. First, you search for the effect you want on Google and add frame by frame after it. As you can see, there are many websites offering free effects. You can also download a green screen video and apply it in editing software, but this method isn't very professional. My method is to first find the effect I need on a site like FreePic, download it, and then use Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop to convert each frame of the effect into a PNG file and save it in a folder for later use in Moho. Now, to create the effect, I go to frame 0 and create an image sequence layer. As soon as I create the layer, a window pops up where I select the images I want for this layer. I've already saved several effects as PNG files using the method I mentioned earlier. I select all the images for the effect and click OK. As you can see, the effect is now ready to use. I shrink the layer size and go to this section in the timeline, which is for moving layers around in the timeline. I move the effect layer to the frame where the shot takes place. This part of the timeline is similar to editing software, where you can move an effect or any layer around. I place the effect at the shot's moment, then duplicate the layer to create 2 more copies and place them in the correct spots. I group the effects and name it Fire Effects. As you can see, the result looks great. Now, I want a bullet to come out of the gun's barrel when it's shot with an effect. So, I go to frame 0, create a new layer called Fire, and use the Draw Shape tool to make a tiny circle as the bullet. I hide the layer at frame 0. Then, I go to the frame where I want the bullet to appear, make the layer visible, and position it right at the moment of the shot. After the shooting effect happens on the rectangular shape, I hide the layer again. I repeat this process for the second and third shots. The result is great, and now we can see the bullet firing at the same time. Next, I want to create a smoke-like effect around the gun's barrel and the bullet when it's shot. I go to frame 0 and create a frame-by-frame layer. Then, I go to the desired frame, click the icon on the left side of the timeline to create a blank frame. When I draw a line or any shape, you'll see the color of this frame changes. I create my desired effect, and after one frame, I click Add Frame to create a new frame and start drawing a few lines as a smoke effect. In the next frame, I add a new frame again using Add Frame, but I don't need to draw an effect because the second shot hasn't happened yet. I keep doing this for the second and third shots. I feel like the effect I created isn't very visible, so I use the Delete Shape tool to remove all the lines, then use the Create Shape tool to select all the lines and click Create Shape. I then adjust the stroke size in the right menu to make it more visible. I do this for all the frames. Now I animate the pen that the stick figure is holding. Next, I want the stick figure to let go of the gun after shooting and draw a hammer shape with the pen. I animate the part where the gun is dropped, and when it hits the ground, I make sure to follow the laws of physics to make it look natural and smooth. Now, it's time for the stick figure to draw a hammer shape. I go to frame 0, create a new layer, and use Create Shape and Add Point to draw a hammer shape, giving it only a stroke. I hide the hammer shape at frame 0. Then, at the right frame, when the stick figure is about to draw the shape, I make the hammer layer visible. And now, just like how I animated the drawing of the gun and the stick figure's shape, I animate this one too. If you've noticed, when I select a layer and want to resize it or move it from one place to another, a red frame appears around the layer in Moho. This frame lets me rotate, move, and resize the shape. I want to create this frame around the hammer in the animation so the stick figure can make the hammer bigger and use it. First, I take a screenshot of this frame and import it into the software. Then I create a new layer called Box for this shape. I draw the shape using the Draw Shape tool, and with the Create Shape tool, I give it a stroke. I adjust the color and stroke size to match the reference shape. Once that's done, I hide the shape at frame 0. Now I want the stick figure to hit the hammer shape after drawing it, and then make it bigger and use it. So, I animate this part for the stick figure as well. Here, when the stick figure clicks on the hammer, I make the box layer visible and position it around the hammer shape. As you can see, as soon as the stick figure clicks on the hammer shape, the resizing frame appears. Now, I continue animating the stick figure. At this point, I want the stick figure to walk backward while pulling the hammer from the frame and toward themselves, making the hammer shape grow larger and ready to use. After that, I animate the hammer and frame enlarging after the stick figure's movement. Finally, I animate the pen as well. Once the hammer animation is done, I want the stick figure to grab the hammer and charge toward the cursor. So first, I'll do the stick figure's animation. At this point, when the stick figure grabs the hammer, I want one hand to be on the far side of the hammer and the other on the near side. I'm going to use a trick here that I'll show you. First, I right-click on the stick figure layer and select Reference Layer to create a reference layer from Knox. When I make any changes to the main layer, it'll also affect the reference layer. I place the main layer underneath the hammer layer. Then when I hide all the parts of the reference layer, you can see that the stick figure's hands are on the far side of the hammer because the stick figure layer is under the hammer layer. So all I need to do is make the left hand of the character visible on the reference layer. This way, the result is exactly what I wanted. From now on, I'll do all the animations on the main layer. Just be careful not to animate on the reference layer. After animating the stick figure, now I'll animate the hammer. After grabbing the hammer, the stick figure will turn around and charge toward the cursor. I'll create the animation for this part too. Before the stick figure jumps, it needs to bend down a bit and prepare for the jump. So now I'll animate the jump. Here, like with the jumping movement, to make the hammer strike look good, I'll create a pose before the hammer strike. Now I'll adjust the frames between the keyframes to make the stick figure's jump movement look smoother and more natural. Okay, now I'll animate the stick figure's strike and then animate the hammer. Next, I'll animate the cursor and the rectangle shape. Like I mentioned before, you're not supposed to animate something once and have it be perfect right away. To get the result you want, you have to animate something over and over, like what I did here. I animated it several times, deleted frames, and reanimated until I got what I wanted. You can only get it right the first time if you have a solid reference. Now, after the stick figure hits the shape with the hammer, the rectangle will break apart and the cursor will be thrown in that direction. So after animating the cursor, it's time for me to show you a new trick, how to animate the breaking of a shape. First, I go to the rectangle shape layer and select and copy the shape. Then I go to frame 0 and create a new layer called block 2. I paste the shape into this new layer, and as you can see, this shape has an animation. So, I shrink the timeline and delete the frames related to this shape so it no longer has an animation. Now I use the Delete Shape tool to get rid of the shape, and then use the Add Point tool to draw lines on the shape. After that, I select the entire shape and set the curvature of all points to 0. Next, I use the Paint Bucket tool to fill in each part of the shape with a different color. Now I select the entire shape again, go to the Scripts menu at the top, and click on RT Break Apart Shapes under Layer Effects. A new menu pops up, and I check these two options and click OK. As you can see, this breaks the shape into multiple layers and groups them together. Now, I don't need the Block 2 layer anymore, so I delete it and rename this group Block 2. Now, each part of the rectangle is in a separate layer, and I can easily animate each part individually. First, I define the center of the group, then go through each layer and define its center. I hide this group at frame 0 so it's not visible until I want to reveal it. At the frame where the hammer hits the rectangle, I make the Block 2 layer visible and position it exactly where the original rectangle layer was. Now, I change the color of all parts of the Block 2 layer to match the original rectangle layer color. At this frame, I hide the block layer. Now, I animate each broken part of the rectangle at the right frames. I start by creating a broken pose at this frame. Now I start animating the broken pieces, beginning with layer 7, which is the lowest broken piece of the rectangle. I have to animate each broken part of the shape in a way that looks natural, so I need to keep in mind how the shape falls and hits the studio floor. As you can see, one part of the rectangle animated properly. Now, let's animate the rest of the broken pieces the same way. It's important to note that with each broken part of the shape, depending on the impact, it might fly in different directions. All right, let's see the result. I think it looks awesome. Now, I want the hammer to break when it hits the rectangle. So I'm going to do the exact same steps I did for the rectangle to make the hammer break. Now that I've set this up, it's time to animate the stick figure first, then the hammer. When the hammer hits the ground, it should shake a little to make it look more natural. Here's a problem. The broken part of the hammer, since it only has a stroke and no fill, makes the stick figure's legs visible behind the shape. To fix this, I need to add a white fill color to the hammer shape along with the stroke. I go to the frame where the hammer shape is complete, select the shape, and check the fill option to add color. Then I change it to white. I do the same for the broken hammer shape. Now I go to the weapon layer and color it in too, to make it look better. After completing this part, it's time to continue the animation. I'll start with the stick figure animation. I want the stick figure to stand weirdly and float calmly. After animating the stick figure, I move on to animating the cursor. In this part, I want the cursor to draw another rectangle and throw it towards the stick figure. So I'll first animate the cursor, and then move on to drawing the rectangle and the rest of the steps. I'll animate this part just like I did in the previous sections, step by step. First, I create a new layer. Then I draw the shape. I hide the shape in frame 0. In the target frame, I make it visible. After that, I scale the shape down and position it at the cursor tip. As the cursor moves, the rectangle will grow. Once the rectangle is complete, the cursor grabs it and throws it towards the stick figure. So, I'll animate both the cursor and the rectangle in this part. Now it's time to animate the stick figure. First, I'll adjust the animation of the stick figure flying. Then I animate it flying towards the cursor. After that, I animate the stick figure colliding with the shape. Next, I animate it hitting the wall. After animating the stick figure, I'll also animate the rectangle. I didn't need to explain these steps in detail because we've already gone through them many times in this course. If you've watched the earlier parts of the video carefully, there shouldn't be anything left to explain. Now, I want the stick figure to slowly get up. In its rage, its eye laser activates, and it shoots the laser towards the cursor and the studio, just like Superman and other superheroes. Once the stick figure's animation is done, I'll animate the cursor. Before the stick figure gets up, the cursor moves towards the X sign, the one used to close the program. Just before the deadly laser hits, the cursor closes the program. Now, I'm going to use the image sequence technique I explained earlier to create some effects in certain parts of the animation. The first part that needs an effect is exactly when the hammer hits the rectangle and breaks it. I create an image sequence layer and choose the effect I want. This time, instead of selecting all the pictures of an effect, I choose the first one and pick every second picture because I want the effect to appear and fade quickly. If I select all the pictures, the effect will last longer and become slower. After importing the effect, I place it exactly where I want it in the right frame, just like I did with the previous effect. Next, I'll add another effect in the part where the stick figure hits the studio wall. After adding the effects for this part, I find an effect for the stick figure's eyes turning red. I place it in the frame when the stick figure is about to get up. I then duplicate the layer for this effect and place the second one next to the first so it represents both eyes of the stick figure. I group both effects together and name the group Eye Laser. Then, I animate the eye laser group frame by frame in the correct position. Finally, I'll add the last effect, which is the laser itself, and I'll keep it short, just a few frames. I place the effect on the stick figure's eye at the exact frame when the laser is fired. In this part, I want the eye laser to stay fixed and bright when the laser is shot from the stick figure's eyes, but the effect I added flickers. So I'll hide the eye laser and import a frame from the eye laser effect that's glowing, turning it into an image. I place this image exactly where the laser is shot from the stick figure's eyes. When the eye laser layer disappears, I make the glowing eye image visible, creating a glowing eye effect at the moment the laser is fired. As you can see, when I move the cursor towards the X sign to close the software, the first thing that happens is the cursor changes, and when it hovers over the X sign gets highlighted in red. I need to animate this part as well. First, I'll animate the cursor changing. Then, I position the cursor over the X in Moho, take a screenshot of the red highlight on the X by pressing the print screen button. I import the screenshot and place it in the correct spot. Now, I'll use the crop tool to select only the part of the image I want, removing any excess edges. I go to frame 0 and hide the image. Then I move to the frame where the cursor is on the X and make the image visible. After that, I place the image layer under the cursor group. That's how I get the effect I wanted. Now, as you can see, the laser effect disappears after a few frames because I created it for just a few short frames. To fix this, I use the same trick I used earlier for the eye laser effect. I import an image of the laser effect I downloaded, and in the frame where the effect disappears, I make the image visible so that the laser effect stays visible. Now, when I click to close the software, a new menu appears asking if I want to save changes. I want to animate this menu too. So, first, I take a screenshot of this menu. I import the menu image into the software and follow the same steps as before. Hide the image in frame 0 and make it visible in the correct frame. Next, I move the cursor to the menu to click Don't Save. As you know, when I click one of the options in this menu, the button gets highlighted. So I hold down the click on Don't Save and press Print Screen to capture the highlighted state. I import this screenshot, position it over the button, and animate it, just like I did for the X animation. After the cursor clicks Don't Save, I want Moho to close and the Windows screen should appear. First, since I no longer need Moho in this scene, I close Moho, click Save so that the project is saved, and take a screenshot of the Windows screen. I save the image and open the project I just saved to import the image into the software. Once I import the image, I place the image layer at the bottom of all layers. I go to the correct frame, and exactly when the cursor clicks Don't Save, I hide the background group, which represents the studio background. I hide all the remaining layers on the screen one by one until only the Windows background and the cursor are left. Now that the animation is set, the only thing left before rendering the final output is animating the camera movement, one of the most important and useful parts of animation. The first thing I do is create a new layer called Camera. Now, in the left menu under the Camera section, we have 4 tools for camera movement, but for 2D animations, we only need the first 2. The first tool is for moving the camera in 4 different directions. As you can see, when I hold down the left mouse button and move the mouse, a rectangle moves along with it. This rectangle represents the camera. The second tool is for zooming in and out. We won't be using the other 2 tools, so let's focus on animating the camera movement professionally. First, I delete the frames created by moving the camera, and in frame 1, I click on the screen to create a keyframe for zooming the camera. Then, I select the second tool and click on the screen to create a keyframe for moving the camera in frame 1. Now, I play the animation. At exactly this moment, when the animator starts drawing the stick figure, I zoom in the camera. As you can see, keyframes have been created, and the animation for the camera movement is made. Keep in mind, when you export the animation, only the part inside this rectangle, the camera view, will be visible in the output. You can also move these frames to make the camera movement slower or faster. Here, I create keyframes for this camera position by clicking on the screen, and a few frames later, I zoom out the camera a bit. I do this because I want the camera to move slightly when the menu appears. This small camera movement can make the animation more engaging, and it also depends on the animator's preference. So I animate the camera movements in the same way I've explained. After animating the camera, I noticed a small issue. When the stick figure is lifted, the cursor is a little too far from the stick figure. I fixed this issue as well. Now that the animation is completely finished, it's time to render the output. First, you need to decide the range of frames you want to export. Then, click on the File menu and select Export Animation. The shortcut is Ctrl-E. After choosing Export Animation, a new window opens. Here, you'll first need to select the frames you want. I'm selecting frames 1 to 1128. Next, under Format, I select Video, and in the Preset section, there are different options to choose from. I go with ASF because it offers high quality, though the downside is that the file size can be quite large. From here, you can specify where you want the file to be saved, and also give the file a name. Finally, I leave all the other settings as default and click OK to start the export process. Now the animation is fully completed, and all that's left is adding sound effects and extra effects for the animation. For sound effects and voiceovers, I recommend these two free software options, CapCut and Filmora. Personally, I find Filmora more comfortable to work with, so I import the animation video file into the software and then start adding the sound. Filmora has a variety of editing options for free, such as different effects, filters, text styles, music, and sound effects. Most of them are free to use in your projects. I use the sound effects from this software and download others from various sites for my animations. In the sound section, as I mentioned, you can search and find various sound effects. For example, for this part, when the animator is about to draw the stick figure, I need a mouse click sound effect. So I search for it here, select a sound, and apply it. All you need to do is select your desired sound effect and drag it under the video track. This sound effect is the click sound from the mouse, so I split the part where the click happens and place it correctly to match the animation. In the same way, I add voiceovers for all parts of the animation. Here, I want to add an effect to the stick figure to show that it came to life by accident. In the Effects menu, you can search and apply different effects. I apply an effect here, reduce its size, and click on Custom in the right menu. With this tool, I select the stick figure drawing so the effect only applies to it. As you can see, the effect is applied perfectly only to the stick figure. I tweak the settings in the right menu to get the desired result. And as you can see, both the sound effects and the glitch effect work well on the stick figure. If you need more effects, you can add them to your animation using this same software. After finishing the voiceover work, to export the file from this software, I click Export, choose the output format, set the frame rate to 60, and the bit rate to 10,000 or higher to ensure better video quality. I also set the audio quality to the highest and apply these changes. Then I choose where to save the file, type in the file name, and click Export. And here's the result, which I uploaded long ago on the channel as the Halloween night video. And that's the end of a complete stick figure animation process in the style of Alan Becker. I hope you enjoyed the video, and this series has helped you a lot in the animation making process. Of course, there were some issues along the way, and I hope you forgive me for those. Thank you for sticking with me until the end, and there are more educational videos on animation coming soon. Until the next videos, take care.